So welcome to this targeted collaborative debate on what is deaccentuation. This is a debate between Michael Wagner at McGill and Anttila at Stanford, who are going to be presenting two different perspectives on this. They have 40 minutes. They're going to split it 20 minutes between them. We'll have presentations from both of them, and then there will be a question period of 20 minutes. 20 minutes here, and then, of course, if you want to take it over to Discord, you're very welcome. The questions should be put in the chat. We'd ask you to mark, if you're putting a question in the chat, we'd ask you to mark the question with an S in parentheses if you are a senior scholar, or a J in parentheses if you are a junior scholar. And I think people get to self-identify as senior or junior. And when we come to the question period, I'll probably take questions in roughly chronological order, but it might be useful to deviate from that if we have thematically related questions that come together, or if they're to ensure balance between senior and junior. And I'm looking here at my checklist if there's anything else that I need to say. I don't think that there is before we go straight into it. So Michael is going to speak first, so the floor is yours.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm going to start sharing. Did this work? Can you see the slides?
Yes, we can.
All right. So what is deaccentuation? Today, we will look at this question with a particular focus on interactions between focus and phonology. We present two perspectives on what to make of these interactions. One perspective says that in some sense, prosodic focus is a metalinguistic operator. And the other perspective says that prosodic focus is post-lexical phonology. So what interactions do we have in mind? So here's one example. It's been observed that sometimes phonological contrast seems to be sufficient to mark prosodic focus. So if you take 1C, John expected to be pro-moded and was shocked at being demoded. Or 1D, Greek divers have found the wreck of the British liner Britannic, sister ship of the Titanic. So here it seems that prosodic focus is marked by deaccentuation, but the motivation for it is purely phonological. What do we mean by deaccentuation? So we mean cases where an accent is not placed where default stress usually falls, reflecting or, depending on theory, giving rise to a marked prominence relation between words and constituents. So it's a deviation from the regular stress pattern, and then you put the accent in a different place because of this. So there are a lot of ideas around about how one might account for such phonological effects, ranging from the psycholinguistic to the more grammatical. So Jacobs et al., for example, proposed that reduction can be the result, what they call repetition reduction, when there's a recently experienced auditory memory of an item. So when you've just heard something, then you will put less prominence on it. Or Williams proposed a rhyming law. The final nucleus of an intonational unit, roughly clause, cannot be identical to any final portion of the preceding intonational unit. So one response to these phonological effects is that we might posit some additional phonological or phonetic constraint in addition to what we need for semantically motivated deaccentuation. But another kind of response would be to rethink what these apparently semantically driven cases, how they actually work. And we'll present two perspectives on this kind of response to this. So let's jump into the first. So there are a couple of accounts that treat phonologically motivated cases of deaccentuation by the same tools that also take care of semantically motivated cases of deaccentuation. So one was actually proposed by Williams himself. So he viewed the rhyming law as just another version of the disanaphora law that he proposes for semantically motivated cases of deaccentuation. But he said that there's disanaphora, what he calls disanaphora, both that can both referentially based and phonetically based. And similarly, Artstein proposed within alternative semantics that there are two kinds of alternatives that you can evoke, alternative meanings or alternative phonological forms. So let me just briefly illustrate what that might look like. So in alternative semantics, if you take a sentence like Ede wants coffee, then Ede here is focus marked. It's marked with an F in the syntax, which has the phonological consequence that it will receive main prominence in the constituent that the focus operator squiggle takes as its argument. And it will have the semantic consequence that we introduce alternatives to the meaning of Ede. And these alternatives are passed up. So we create alternative meanings of the form Ede wants coffee, Sally wants coffee, and so on. And the squiggle operator will then require that such alternatives are contextually salient. So we can only use the pronunciation Ede wants coffee when such alternatives are present. Artstein extends this to phonological cases of focus marking by saying that you can alternatively also just evoke phonological alternatives. So if you say deported, you can just evoke alternatives of the form where you just substitute the phonological piece the, and that is another way to motivate than focus marking. So this kind of approach raises the expectation that we should find parallels between meaning-only motivated cases of deaccentuation and form-only motivated cases of deaccentuation. And I want to look at 4 parallels and then discuss what these parallels might tell us how this really works. So the first question or first parallel is that form and meaning are each sufficient triggers for deaccentuation. So when we have repetition, which is we get the same word with the same phonological form and the same meaning, nobody's surprised that deaccentuation might happen, and there are different accounts of how this happens. The interesting cases are when the antecedent just has the same meaning or it just has the same pronunciation. So same meaning antecedents are sufficient for deaccentuation. So I went to see the dentist, I could kill the butcher. The word butcher hasn't been used before, but butcher can be deaccented here. Or Amal gave up, then Frankie threw in the towel. Threw in the towel can be deaccented here because gave up was present and that has the same meaning, but not the same phonological form. So a same form also sufficient to cause deaccentuation. So this is joint work with Marion Coumel at Warwick University, where we looked at homophones and how they are treated. So the interesting example is the homophone example here. The fear was hard to bear. He really did not like that bear. Or the fear was hard to bear. He really did not like that bear, where deaccented. So what people do with cases like this, so this was a production experiment. We annotated whether deaccentuation happened or not. You can see that even for the repetition case, it's not at 100%. There was a certain rate, probably depends on the precise materials, etc. But the rate for homophones was pretty high, right? It was lower than when you have repeat repetitions, but deaccentuation was clearly used a lot. So it seems that deaccentuation is sufficient. These no's and yeses up here are links to sound files from actual examples from the experiment. So homophones do lead speakers to deaccent. A second parallel. Deaccentuation is preferred when possible. So if I say I've made some coffee, then it would be very weird to respond, could I have some coffee? Or I went to see the dentist. If you then say I could kill the butcher, then it seems kind of unfair to the butcher in this case, because it can't be the same person. So what about cases with a form only antecedent? Is then deaccentuation also preferred when possible? So Williams says yes. John does not usually give advice to his son, but he did recently tell him not to look at the sun. So according to Williams, this sounds weird, but is deaccentuation actually possible here? So this is where it gets complicated. So yes, in the sense as our experiment shows that it happens, people do it, but it's not clear that it's actually good when you do it. So here, when you deaccent the celestial body sun, it might sound weird, and William says it sounds weird because the meaning of sun is not contextually given. So we tested this, Mario and I, in these experiments, and it's complex. So sometimes this seems fine and sometimes it's not fine. And I could elaborate on this, but I won't here for reasons of time. So this, by the way, is what I would call the Williams effect, because Williams observed it. But here's a much clearer case of the Williams effect where the judgments are clearer. Jordan kissed Lane and then Lane kissed Jordan. That's completely fine. But takes the third example, Jordan kissed Lane and then Jordan was kissed by Lane. That is very weird. So in perception, people rate it as not great. In production, what people do is they shift prominence away. And it's really for phonological reasons here, because if you substitute with a pronoun, it doesn't happen. And then, so in the production experiment, like active passive order was counterbalanced, and also whether it was pronouns or non-pronouns in the antecedents. It's really a phonological effect. You don't want to accent the same thing twice. That's the Williams effect. So what people do is they avoid the Williams effect by putting accents, for example, on by, or on the auxiliary, or on the participle, actually. So deaccentuation can be obligatory when possible, also just for phonological reasons. Just like it can be obligatory when possible, just for semantic reasons. The contrast requirement. So deaccentuation requires a semantic contrast. So let's first look at 8C. Guess what Jody's aunt, who deals with used bicycles, brought for his birthday? A new bicycle. So in this case, people more often than not deaccent bicycle because there's a contrast between new bicycle and used bicycle. But the second example, 8B, guess what Jody's aunt, who produces expensive bicycles, brought for his birthday? A new bicycle. So here people usually accent bicycle, although bicycle is mentioned, and although there's even another expression of the form adjective bicycle, expensive bicycle. But these are just not used as alternatives to each other. There's no semantic contrast. So there's a contrast requirement on this kind of deaccentuation. This is again going back to the experiments with Marion Coumel. Here's another condition which we had in a follow-up experiment, which replicated. So the proportions you will notice are slightly different, but and the materials were also slightly different, but it replicates what you saw earlier, that for homophones, people do deaccent. But if you give people exact repetitions, then they don't. So here's an example of the all repeated condition. They were surprised by a bear. Despite their best efforts, they were surprised by a bear. So here people don't avoid the rhyming law problem, the fact that you accent the same word twice in a row by shifting prominence, but that's because it's completely repeated, so there's no contrast here. So I call this parallel 3, and the next example should now be a case where there's really a phonology only antecedent that causes this effect, but there's sort of different data points that one could discuss. But overall, like, you require a contrast, and it seems like both a phonological and a semantic one, but for the phonological side of this parallel, it's a little more complicated, and I could elaborate on this. The final parallel, the need for a semantic alternative. I think there's a missing piece in the puzzle of phonological contrast, and that is that phonological contrast also requires semantic contrast. So here again, the examples from the beginning where for phonological reasons there was deaccentuation, But in these cases, the relevant words were all used in contrast to each other. So John expected to be promoted and was shocked at being demoted. Promoted and demoted are used as contrasts to each other. So let's look at an example where that is not the case. Take 11C. She had had a nightmare that she just remembered. She had dreamt she fought aliens, whom she all, and is it now dismembered or dismembered? So this is, again, from a production experiment that unfortunately is only partially analyzed. But essentially, in this case, so this was the non-alternative case. Remembered and dismembered are not used as alternatives to each other. And then people do not deaccent. So it seems that making a phonological contrast within a word requires a semantic contrast to the word or between the words. Could this be because some prefixes are unstressable or they're not prosodic words? So there's actually an interesting relevant literature around this question, and Artstein discusses how this bears on focus marking, and Wennerstrom actually. But this will not be a sufficient explanation, I think, because you can use the very same words and make them either deaccent or not. So take 12C, this drug will not help you remember your trauma. It will help you dismember your trauma. So here, remember and dismember are used as alternatives. And unfortunately, I didn't use the same word pairs in the experiment, but that's going to be the next experiment. So the idea will be that people will spontaneously deaccent dismember in this case. But I mean, this example I should maybe mention, I haven't experimentally tested. So what do we make of this? Even phonological contrast involves or requires semantic alternatives. This is actually incompatible with Artstein's account of phonological contrast, whereas phonological contrast should be sufficient. So I think what this tells us is that prosodic focus always involves linguistic alternatives. So we substitute alternatives syntactically, and we create a set of alternatives that are linguistic objects, and the meanings of these objects have to be semantically relevant alternatives. Well, so if you say Ede wants coffee, then you substitute pieces that replace Ede, and you create alternative linguistic expressions of the form X wants coffee, and the meanings of those expressions are the relevant semantic alternatives. So the case of phonological contrast is no different. When you say dismember, you substitute pieces, alternative pieces for dis, and then the meanings, for example, remember, right? You replace this with re, and the meaning of remember has to be a semantically, pragmatically relevant alternative to the meaning of dismember. So prosodic focus is a metalinguistic operator in the sense that it operates over linguistic alternatives. So this approach is compatible with uses of focus that are actually metalinguistic, as they have been described in the literature, or with expression focus, which, you know, sort of another term for certain kinds of metalinguistic focus. But it is not restricted to the metalinguistic uses. So metalinguistic use would be, I didn't say jalapeno, I said jalapeno. Right? I mean, that is a metalinguistic use of focus, but it's not restricted to this because prosodic focus even ranges, the idea is, over linguistic objects in non-metalinguistic focus. This is just how we generate the alternatives. We generate alternative linguistic expressions, and then their meanings have to be the relevant semantic alternatives. So this fits with the observation that salience is required for the antecedents for focus marking, because now what we need is a linguistic antecedent similar to VP ellipsis or other surface anaphora. And it also fits with Alexander Goebbels' finding that focus sensitive presuppositions require salient localization. So I think some reason to this. So there's many questions that I couldn't address here, but one seems particularly pressing because towards the beginning, I showed examples that pure meaning antecedents are sufficient for focus marking. So here's one. Again, Amal gave up, then Frankie threw in the towel. So here we would substitute, alternative pieces for Frankie and create alternatives of the form X threw in the towel, but we will not find a linguistic antecedent of that shape. The only thing we have is Amal gave up. So I think there's sort of, accommodation of a linguistic antecedent is necessary here, but I think that's not implausible, because if we compare it to VP ellipsis, then we can find a similar antecedent. So you can do, Robin was getting bludgeoned during the boxing fight. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw her coach reach for the white towel. She said, "Please don't." So such cases have been, reported to be good and experimentally tested and found to be good. So maybe this is not an implausible assumption to be made. And that's it for the metalinguistic perspective.
Arthur, you have to unmute.
Okay, is this better? Can you guys hear me? All right, so after Michael's presentation of the alternative view of focus, here's a phonological perspective. Most of my data, in fact, all of it, I think, comes from inaugural addresses of US presidents, and they are extremely nice set of subjects. Most of them are Republicans, but that is not intended as a political statement of any kind. So here we have Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush. You meet heroes across the counter, and they are on both sides of that counter. We will build our defenses beyond challenge, lest weakness invite challenge. Okay. Now, this is the accentuation, as we heard from Michael's part. Is the accentuation a cognitive universal of some kind that people have thought that, or maybe it's just common sense? Why emphasize what's given information? Now, the problem for that view, which would be attractive, is that the accentuation is language specific and dialect specific. Not all dialects of English have it. Romance languages don't seem to have it. So there's something to do, it has something to do with the grammar of English, of particular dialects of English. It's also independent of meaning, again, as Michael pointed out. Given information can be accented, new information can be de-accented, and de-accentuation in some cases applies to meaningless strings. Third problem, and this is an important one, is that de-accentuation has very strange phonological consequences. And the key consequence is that it results in automatic pre-accentuation, which is totally odd from a kind of information given new point of view. Now, what is de-accentuation? I would like to define it as to be perceived with less stress than expected. And I'm using the word stress for a reason, not pitch accent. This is a statement, but I will not defend it. And now, what is perceived stress? That's easy. You ask native speakers, where did you hear that stress? Where did you hear the accent? What is expected stress is much harder. But luckily, we have a lot of research on this. And we rely on Chomsky and Halley 1968. The SPE has a beautiful rule called the nuclear stress rule. And it may not be 100% correct, but it's good in the sense that it's a very simple rule. It can be implemented computationally. So these days we have NLP tools that you can just run syntactic parser and all these presidential speeches. Then you can apply the nuclear stress rule to the syntactic trees that you get, and you can actually get a predicted SPE number for every word in the president's speeches, and that's what we did. So we have a baseline to compare the perceived stress to. Okay, here's an example from LAD, as many of these examples are. I brought her a bottle of whiskey, but it turns out she doesn't like whiskey. It's not liked by native speakers all that much. What's much better is that you retract the stress from whiskey to like. So you say, I brought her a bottle of whiskey, but it turns out she doesn't like whiskey. Sounds better. Now, this can be quantified. So as again, Mihail pointed out very nicely in many places, there's a lot of variability in this. So deaccentuation is an optional process, and it can be done to some degree. So here's one way to look at it. So we can take the perceived stress. Here's let's say an annotation by someone, lest weakness invite challenge. So you put the nuclear stress on invite, and challenge gets deaccented. So you have stress numbers 3 and 2. I present these as grids, but they are basically just DSP stress numbers. The predicted stress, on the other hand, would be lest weakness invite challenge, where nuclear stress goes on challenge. Now we can get the accentuation index for each word by subtracting from the perceived stress the expected stress. So you get zeros on the first 2 words, we get 1 on the 3rd word, and -1 on challenge, because it is 3 minus 2 and 2 minus 3. So this is the way we can quantify the accentuation. So every word has 2 numbers, the predicted stress and the observed stress. Now, here's another example, and this is going to be interesting. So accented words can be given, deaccented words can be new. That's totally surprising from the information point of view. And here's from Ronald Reagan. Well, I believe we, the Americans of today, are ready to act worthy of ourselves, ready to do what must be done to ensure happiness and liberty for ourselves, our children, and our children's children. Okay, the nuclear accent falls on the penultimate children, not on the final, so that would be the nuclear stress rule. But why is that? Well, if you think about it, it's kind of strange because there are 3 instances of children. There's the first children, that's kind of new in every way, haven't been mentioned before. Second children should be deaccented because it's given, semantically given. It refers to the same children as children 1. It's also a repeat of that children, yet it has nuclear stress. Okay, so that's odd. Children number 3 should be accented for a couple of reasons. I mean, well, it's the final content word also, and it's also new because it's my kid, my children's children, which is a separate set of individuals, but it gets deaccented. So this goes completely against the given news story. The second problem for the simple view, this given new view, is that you can get it applied to meaningless material. I'm just elaborating on what Mihail said already. We agree on this. So if you ask someone how old are you, they might say I'm 15. I'm 16. If you count, you shift the stress. You say 15, 16, 17. This is known. Why? Well, you do not want to accent identical phonological material. You shift the whole stress pattern to the left. TV and radio call signs are a great source of examples. So you can say things like, I get ABC on channel 7 and NBC on channel 11. These letters don't mean anything. You're just trying to avoid accenting what's already said before. Now, there are 2 conflicting phonological generalizations here that we can see. And this is joint work with Naomi Shapiro, and I want to emphasize that she has done wonderful work on this, and I'm just presenting this empirical data. So you want to avoid a stress peak on a word that has a copy in the preceding context. And the interesting thing is, turns out distance matters. So the closer the word is, the more you deaccent. Second thing is that we know the stress peaks want to fall as near the right phrase edge as possible. That's the nuclear stress rule of Chomsky and Halley. And you can just translate it into OT if you like. So you have 2 constraints. You don't stress a copy, and you stress the rightmost. And these are just the same things said in optimality theory. It's pretty obvious. Now you can see how this analysis works. I brought her a bottle of whiskey, but it turns out she doesn't like whiskey. You don't stress the final whiskey because that would violate stress copy. You retract the stress to like. That's enough to avoid stress copy violation. You don't retract it any further, so doesn't get stressed because that's too far. So it's kind of obvious OT logic here. Our children's children, which was a problem for the kind of semantic view, comes out very nicely. The prediction is that you would put the stress on the leftmost copy of the identical copies, because that way you minimize the number of stress copy violations. And this actually works in a number of cases, so it has nothing to do with meaning, it's just phonology. Here's the Williams effect that Michael mentioned. So John saw Mary, and then Mary saw John, comes out fine. John saw Mary, and then John was seen by Mary, is not good. And this is why. Again, Mary saw John, putting stress on John. So it doesn't matter where you put the stress, you're going to violate stress copy. In such cases, stress goes to the rightmost word, that is emergence of the unmarked. If you cannot help it, then you stress the final. If you can, as in the second case, you will retract. So you will retract the stress to by, and Michael had empirical evidence that in fact people most of the time stress by. They also sometimes stress seen, which is interesting and has to do with whether you want to stress content words, function words or not. So here's another example where you don't get any stress shift. Again, this is Michael's example where you have two identical, so they were surprised by a bear. You repeat the very same string and stress doesn't budge. It goes on the final word, again, because of rightmost. So the stress copy it cannot distinguish the different stress placements. The interesting case is, what if there's like one little difference between? So let's say the second sentence is slightly different, add a word that looks different. Here's an example from Ronald Reagan. And these inaugurals are wonderful because it is a kind of rhetorical device of choice in this genre to repeat. The presidents repeat. That's wonderful examples. Putting America back to work means putting all Americans back to work. So what you have is accent on all, and everything after the accent gets de-accented. Again, you could say that, well, he wants to emphasize all and it's focused, perhaps, but the other thing you can say is that, well, look, I mean, if he had put stress on work, to, back, or Americans, that would violate stress copy. Putting it any further to the left would be too much. So you put it on all because that's the first word that is different between the first and the second sentence. So it's completely mechanical again. It may overlap with the semantic explanation, but phonology is sufficient to get this right. Here's, by the way, just to show that I'm not making up the data, here's one annotator's numbers. So this is a native speaker annotator, and I have to rely on native speakers because I'm not one. You have deaccentuation on every second, every repeat. So putting goes down from 0 to -1, America goes from 1 to 0, etc., etc. All is the one that gets a positive accentuation index, exactly as you can hear if you listen to Reagan speak on the YouTube video. Now how about focus? I mean, it's obvious that meaning matters to stress, and just in case you thought that I say deaccentuation is all phonology all the way down, it is clearly not. It's an overstatement. Phonology plays a role, but there are things that you cannot do with it. So people who grow rice eat rice would be the neutral way of saying this, again, because of stress copy. You retract stress from rice to eat. But if you have contrastive focus, you introduce an alternative. So people who grow rice eat rice, people who grow beans eat beans. In that case, you override the phonological tendency, and instead you stress rice because it's contrasted with beans. And that it requires a constraint, something like assign a violation to a focused constituent that does not contain a stress peak, by which I mean primary stress. Now, how did we, what's the empirical results? So this is, Naomi and I tested this on the corpus. We did regression modeling of this. So the dependent variable is accentuation index. So whether you are less or more than predicted accent. The predictors of fixed effects were the repetition, which is the distance between a repeat and its antecedent labeled on the repeat. So that's a continuous variable. The closer you are to the deaccentuation site, the more you deaccent. So the closer the two copies are, the bigger the effect. Retraction was the other variable. That's basically asking, how much do I accent the preceding content word? Because reaccentuation for us is stress retraction. You retract the stress from the last word to the preceding content word. Does that effect show up in the president's corpus? That's the retraction variable. And we also control for the president, annotator, and word type and had different models for different parts of speech. Here's the model summary. It works out as expected. So what this means is that for nouns, adjectives, words, verbs, and function words, independently, what you get is the closer the two copies are, the bigger the accentuation effect. That's the repetition variable. And the second thing is that the closer the two copies are, the bigger the accentuation of the preceding word. So both the deaccentuation and accentuation work together. That's what we would expect if this is stress retraction. The effect, the accentuation, the stress retraction effect is only found in nouns and nouns and verbs. It's slightly iffy on adjectives. It's almost significant. We didn't even test it on function words because function words are not, we did not consider them as possible landing sites for stress. So sometimes, just one more thing. So how about these cases like Harry wants a Volkswagen, but his wife would like an American car, where you don't have a phonological copy? Well, I think that would be pragmatics for you. So what's happening here is that people put deaccentuation into productive rhetorical use. So English speakers know that when you deaccent, there's something identical in the preceding sentence, usually phonology, okay? If you say something like, John called Mary a something or other, and then she insulted him, implies that whatever that something or other is an insult. Okay, you can substitute your favorite label, and that would basically mean you take you are exploiting the phonological rule of English to make a rhetorical point. That's what's going on. This is entirely productive. It is not semantic, but a speaker-defined thing. So that's the best we can offer at this point. Summary is here. So I have tried to make the case that deaccentuation is a phonological rule of English. Doesn't refer to meaning. Deaccentuation means that you are perceived with less stress than expected, which requires reference to the nuclear stress rule, and it requires reference to metrical structure. And that deaccentuation is indeed stress retraction. And all of these points are actually very persuasively argued for by Ladd in his dissertation already. So this is not news. Okay, it's just that we are very happy to find that he was right. There's also the decay effect, that the further away the two copies are, the less effect you get. And that's probably just performance. There's a performance overlay to anything we do in language, and this could be it. Here's now, if I'm done with my part, should I just read these questions or should I let everyone read them? Maybe I can let you look at these questions instead of my mouthing them, and then I would like to invite, or Michael and I would like to invite you to ask questions and challenges. So thank you so much.
Thank you both very much for that very interesting presentation or presentations. So we'll now go over to the question period. One thing I forgot to mention at the start was that when you put your questions, any question that you have into the chat, you should also indicate whether you want to read them out or if you want me to read them out. Right, so that's in addition to the J or S for junior or senior scholar. And I know that people might take a little time to type, so I'm going to abuse the chair and get us started while they're typing and ask a question of my own. And it's specifically a question to Arto, and it's about what the last part there about these called Mary and Idiot cases. And so I have a question. So in general, I really like the idea that we could handle all of this or most of this modulo focus marking, contrastive focus marking phonologically. But I have two questions about the deaccentuation in the John called Mary an idiot and then she insulted him cases. So one question is that you say here deaccentuation invites the hearer to identify two strings. They're not quite two strings though, because in that example it's discontinuous, right? So called Mary an idiot, it's actually called gap an idiot that's being equated with insulted. And it's also the case that, at least for me, it's not just that I can use deaccentuation as a kind of optional rhetorical device. I have to deaccent John called Mary an idiot and then she insulted him. If I say and then she insulted him, then I'm given the impression that the first, calling someone an idiot wasn't an insult. Yeah. So there's two. I don't know if that's, and I don't know if either of those things are actually issues for you or not, but they were things that occurred to me anyway.
Should I just answer right away?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I don't think they're a problem. I mean, the neutral, the second accent pattern that you gave, I think, is the neutral stress, because she insulted him. Is what the nuclear stress rule predicts, because she and him cannot be stressed because they're function words. So stress will by default fall on the verb, and that's like the, if you like, the broad focus accent pattern. My view of this is that focus means what the focus stress pattern is. It's the other. It's the alternative stress pattern. That is, if you deaccent invite, that is the unexpected odd stress pattern, and then the hearer will scramble for an explanation, because what happened here, like you say, there's no identical copy in the preceding context of any kind, and you just make your best guess, like I'm going to assume that the speaker means something with this special stress pattern. So this is the marked versus unmarked versus marked stress pattern. The marked stress pattern invites the inference that something odd is going on, and you do your best to understand. I mean, and this depends on the speaker and your shared knowledge and all kinds of complicated things that I do not understand. And I would really invite a real life semantics pragmatics person to comment on this. This is kind of what I think Rochemont calls it, just accommodation. I can see that I'm not answering your question directly, because you're asking about the discontinuous nature of this thing, and that I really don't know how to address. Michael, can you address it?
Well, I mean, then under a focus theory account, I think the issue doesn't arise in the same way, because I mean, I guess under a metalinguistic focus account, you would have to accommodate a linguistic antecedent, but I think this would work, in the same way as through in the towel, if that works. And if you don't go the metalinguistic way, then there might be no problem whatsoever for focus theory, right? So, I mean.
Okay, thank you. I will stop abusing the chair now, and because we have lots of people popped up in the chat with questions, and so the first person I'd like to call on is Heather Newell.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. I really like this discussion because I think this kind of debate allows us to ask not only can we do the same thing in two different theories or two different theoretical frameworks, but then do we want to, right? So what kinds of things are possible? So I guess I want to ask both of you about what you think of modularity. Right. Specifically speaking about the question of whether it's circular to say focus determines location, right? So focus is non-phonological, right? It has something to do with meaning, right? I know I saw, Arto, that you had a constraint that said something like, if focused things are not stressed, a sign of violation, which means therefore that focus is in the phonology. Right. What does that mean for focus to be in the phonology? So what kinds of things can be in your phonology? And then also, I guess for Mikhail, also like in a metalinguistic kind of analysis, what kinds of things can be in there or cannot be in there? And do we want to think about the same kind of restrictions on whether we mix phonology and semantics in the same rule or constraint?
Shall I go first, or
Go
do you
ahead.
want to go first, Arto? Okay.
No, you go ahead.
I like this question because I think that's, prosodic focus sort of inherently has this problem, right? In a way, I mean, the question, you could look at this debate as the question, is deaccentuation about semantics or about phonology? But in some sense, I think the answer to that question is it's about syntax. And I think there you have less of a problem in terms of modularity because at least if you think that syntax operates over things that have a phonological representation, right, which one may or may not, then in a way, I think the metalinguistic theory raises less of a modularity issue because you're just using the syntactic representation to generate alternatives of linguistic expressions, and they are then used by the semantics, which does raise architectural questions, of course, but I would say that I would hope that it's systematic, that whenever you get prosodic effects of focus, it must be at the level of the linguistic alternatives, and not purely in some weird mapping between semantics and phonology directly.
So my answer to your question is that at least at myself, I see myself doing exactly what everybody else has done for decades, which is you can assume this to be the story that Jack and Dov offered. You have semantic focus, which focus is semantic. And in syntax, you have F markers that mark the focused word with an F. That's a syntactic object. And then those get interpreted by phonology. And we know that syntax needs to be interpreted by phonology, else we wouldn't get phrasal stress right. Syntax needs to know, phonology needs to know something about syntax. And if that's true, then it will have to know about the F markers. That's about as far as I go. So I'm very happy to go with the standard modular view. I'm not arguing for anything exotic.
I guess just to elaborate, I'm wondering what's the difference between something like tone or nasality or vowel height as a morpheme, as opposed to a focus marker that appears to be stress as a morpheme. Right? And so do we need focus in the phonology, or do we just need a lexical representation of stress? And then, anyway, there's lots of questions, but thanks, yeah.
If I can say one thing is that for me, stress is what focus is, how focus is realized. So that it's a minority view. I think most people would talk about pitch accents. So that's a tonal view, and that's the intonational phonology view, and that has problems that are independent of this. So I would refer to Ladd's book, Ladd's international phonology book, with a very persuasive argument for the stress view of focus prominence. And you're asking why. So stress actually relates to lots of things. It relates to vowel quality and pitch and all sorts of other things. So that's of course true, but not directly. So what focus does control is stress, in my view, and the rest is a consequence of that.
Thanks.
Okay. We'll move on. So I'd like to now call Bronwyn Bjorkman, and then after her, we'll move on to Frances Torres Tamarit, and then some trying to keep some balance between S's and J's here. But first, Bronwyn, please.
Thanks very much. So I have a question that's maybe about genre, and it's something that sort of came up in both talks. So in one of Michael's examples, there was the remember dismember pair, which I agreed with the judgment about where emphasis went, but it did seem to me that that pair of lines fit into sort of a metrical pair. They rhymed. And then the examples from presidential speeches involve a very particular rhetorical style. So this is really please tell me more about intonation. The extent to which we should be worried that there are special intonational styles that go with verse for sure, or with public speaking. And we want a grammar of those, but is that the same grammar as the one that we find in other rhetorical settings? I'm interested to learn that it is the same, but I'm very curious.
Do you want to go first on this, or can I say something?
You should go ahead.
So that's a great question, and I'm interested in how this spans genres. But the reason I think the remember and dismember example sounded a bit like rhyme is because they were written such that it's the end of a sentence in both cases, which sort of is like then a line. But that's because I wanted to make it fit the rhyming law, which is end of intonational phrase. So the original Ladd example about Britannic Titanic is not, it doesn't sound poetic, but you're right. And even some of the participants at the end of the experiment, they can comment at the end what they think it was about. They think it has something to do vaguely with rhyming. I don't think it's specific to that, but I think one should do maybe a similar study where the stimuli are written such that it doesn't evoke rhyming. But I do think that these constraints, they will apply across genres. So for example, in a paper with Kate McCurdy, we argued that the reason that in English identical rhyme is bad, but in French it is not bad, has focus reasons. So the Williams effect effectively explains this. And we showed that in French, the Williams effect doesn't apply, but also identical rhymes are good. And that's even true at the individual level. The more an individual has a Williams effect, oddly, the more they dislike identical rhymes. I think the genre is important to keep in mind, and it creates methodological issues. For example, you can't test the prosody of repetitions without getting into the rhetorical question, because otherwise there must be a rhetorical reason to repeat yourself. Otherwise, it's just weird. So it's a very important thing to consider. But I think it's if we could hold this constant, we would see the effects, survive kind of.
So I'd like to make 2 points. The first one is the reason Naomi and I and Tim and Daniel took the presidents as a target is convenience, because they are public individuals. You can, every one of you can go and listen to these examples. They're available, they're public data, that's great. And when presidents try to impress the whole nation, they practice, they do it very well. They are very well-trained speakers. And it's like a little laboratory. They're all in the same place. Everything's controlled. They all middle-aged men. They all have the same job, and that makes they are emotionally engaged in the topic, which increases the prosodic range they have. So that it's a very nice kind of lab experiment in a way. So that's why it's very attractive. So it's like if you want to study astronomy, you don't go to Iceland on a cloudy day. I mean, you go to Southern California where you can see things clearly. And this is like the sort of place where you can see the prosody clearly if you look at the presidents. The other point I wanted to make is that I would not think that the presidents speak any special dialect of like a genre of English. After all, I mean, they're addressing the American public, and they probably want to identify with the majority of Americans. And so it would be very strange if they use some odd style that would not correspond to what everyone knows. So these are kind of maybe after the fact rationalizations of what we did, but I don't think it's unreasonable to pick a particular rhetorical genre. At least it's easy and it can tell us something.
20 minutes goes quite fast, but I'll call on Francesc Tamarit. That from looking at my clock, that'll probably have to be our last question, but we can see. But in any case, Shiku.
Okay, I'll try to be fast. Thank you for your talk. I have a clarification question for Arto on the case of stress retraction with from Regan with multiple copies. Can you go to the tableau for children's children?
Absolutely. Let me.
I have it open, but maybe for people will be nice.
I think I'm almost there. It's right here.
Yeah, this one. Yeah. So I was thinking about a third candidate, like children's children, in which the first element is deaccented with only one grid mark. Okay, and then the second copy receives nuclear stress. So this candidate would just be the mirror image of the winning candidate in this tableau, but with the first element deaccented instead of the second. So maybe this is not possible because of a third constraint, I don't know, because from what I've understood, the first instance of children in candidate A here receives 2 grid marks, right? It's not deaccented because it's not underlined. Wouldn't this candidate with left deaccentuation win, as it would satisfy both star stress copy and rightmost? Or maybe there is another constraint that prevents deaccenting the first element. Thank you.
Okay. That's a great question. You're actually asking about secondary stresses, and so would it be? And the answer is this: we are only in this simplified. This is a simplified tableau, and it only considers primary stress. So we only have one peak, one stress per.
I see. Okay. Center. Right.
If I think there are of course more candidates, and that would involve positing more levels of stress. Now the quantitative analysis we have then addresses that point, because we're actually looking at the accentuation as a gradient measure. So we have degrees. And there we kind of have an answer for you, but this tableau is just for illustration.
Yeah, okay, good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. At least by my clock, I'll let one of the Go board of the technical chairs overrule me if we really want to go a bit longer, but I think we've unfortunately run out of time. However, happily, of course, we have the Discord in which all your remaining questions can be posed and where the debate can continue.